Welcome to this deep dive into some fascinating stories and research that shed light on what it means to be human. You've got a really interesting mix of material for you today. Excerpts from a book called The 10 Types of Human, some academic studies, historical accounts, and even personal narratives.
Yeah, it's a unique blend that lets us look at human nature and resilience and the challenges people face, both individually and as part of larger societies.
Okay, so let's unpack this. One of the stories that really grabbed my attention was Anthony's. He was enslaved as a child on Lake Volta in Ghana, forced to work in incredibly dangerous conditions. But what struck me was his incredible resilience. He managed to escape.
His story really highlights the power of the human spirit to endure such hardship and still find the strength to escape is remarkable. It speaks to a deep well of resilience within him.
It makes you wonder how anyone can hold on to hope in such a horrific situation. It also made me think about empathy, our ability to understand and share the feelings of others. We often hear about the power of empathy, but what about its limitations?
That's a great question. We may instinctively feel empathy for someone like Anthony, but there's a phenomenon called compassion collapse that researchers have observed. It's this tendency to shut down emotionally when we're confronted with suffering on a massive scale.
So it's like our empathy has a bandwidth limit.
It does seem that way. One explanation is that constantly experiencing empathy, especially for large-scale tragedies, can lead to emotional exhaustion and burnout. Think about it. If we were to truly absorb the suffering of every person experiencing hardship in the world, it would be emotionally crippling.
That makes sense. But then how do we explain those individuals who dedicate their lives to helping others, who constantly confront these large-scale issues?
That's where individual differences and coping mechanisms come into play. Some people may have a higher tolerance for experiencing empathy, while others might have developed specific strategies to manage their emotional response. But even those individuals have to be mindful of their own well-being and recognize when they need to step back and recharge.
It's a reminder that even empathy has to be approached with a sense of balance and self-care. Speaking of balancing individual needs with the needs of the group, there's this other story that resonated with me about Kathy Bulkovac. She was a UN peacekeeper in Bosnia who exposed a sex trafficking ring.
Kathy's story is incredibly powerful because it demonstrates the challenges individuals face when they go against the grain. Even for a righteous cause, she faced immense pressure, even ostracism for speaking out against a system that was deeply corrupt.
It seems like the pull of the group, that need to conform, can be incredibly strong, even when it means tuning a blind eye to something horrific.
Researchers have actually studied this dynamic in a lab setting. Believe it or not, there's a famous experiment called the cyberball experiment, where participants were excluded from a simple virtual ball-tossing game. The researchers found that even this virtual exclusion triggered feelings of real pain and distress in the participants.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like our brains are hardwired to crave social connection and belonging.
Exactly. And this need for belonging, for acceptance by the group, can be so powerful that it sometimes overrides our moral compass. It helps explain why people might participate in harmful behaviors or remain silent in the face of injustice, simply to avoid being ostracized by their peers.
So in Kathy's case, her decision to speak out, knowing she'd face rejection from her colleagues, makes her actions even more courageous. It shows that sometimes individual moral convictions can be stronger than the pull of the group.
Absolutely, and it underscores the importance of fostering environments where individuals feel safe to speak up against wrongdoing, even if it means challenging the status quo. But it also makes you think about the flip side. How can we leverage this need for belonging to promote positive social change?
That's a fascinating question. It seems like there's a lot of potential there. If we can understand how this pull of the group works, maybe we can use it to encourage pro-social behaviors like cooperation and altruism.
Now let's turn our attention to some individuals who faced deeply personal struggles. The story of Tony Nicholson. A man with locked-in syndrome is particularly thought-provoking. He campaigned tirelessly for the right to die with dignity, raising a whole host of complex ethical questions about autonomy and suffering.
His story made me think about Ernest Becker's book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, where he argues that our awareness of death is a driving force behind so much of human behavior. It makes sense. If we know our time is limited, we grapple with the significance of our lives and how we want to be remembered.
It's a powerful concept. And in Tony's case, he was facing his mortality head-on, demanding control over his own narrative even in the face of unimaginable suffering. It forces us to confront our own discomfort with death and how we make meaning in the face of it.
It's a stark contrast to Soraya's story. She was a young woman from the Central African Republic who witnessed the brutal murder of her father during a diamond robbery. Her story brings up the devastating impact of violence and displacement, themes that emerge again and again in the materials we're looking at.
What's striking is how often these acts of violence are tied to the desire for power and control over resources. Sadly, the pursuit of wealth and dominance can override basic human compassion.
It's heartbreaking. Yeah. But it speaks to a darker side of human nature. It seems like we're capable of both incredible acts of kindness and unimaginable cruelty.
That's a perfect segue into this idea of the 10 types of human that we see in our source material. It's a framework that suggests different evolutionary modules influence our behavior in different situations.
It's like we have this toolkit of behavioral responses, and the situation dictates which tools we reach for.
Exactly. So someone like Anthony, who exhibited incredible resilience and courage, might be tapping into a different set of types than someone who participates in a violent act.
So are you saying that certain people are predisposed to certain behaviors based on these types?
Not necessarily. It's not a deterministic model. It's more about understanding the range of human potential and how different motivations and behaviors can manifest in different contexts. It also allows us to see how these types can be expressed in both pro-social and harmful ways.
So it's more about understanding the blueprint, but recognizing that each individual expresses those types in their own unique way.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really interesting question. If we can understand these underlying motivations and patterns of behavior, can we use that knowledge to create a more just and compassionate world? Can we nudge people towards expressing those types in a more positive way?
That's something I'm definitely going to be thinking about. If human behavior isn't simply pre-programmed, then we have the potential to make choices, to shape our own destinies, both individually and collectively.
It's a question worth exploring, and to add another layer to this discussion of human behavior, let's bring in the concept of parent-offspring conflict.
Okay, I'm all ears. It seems like a bit of a contradiction. Don't parents usually prioritize their children's well-being above all else?
They do, of course, but evolutionary biology suggests there's a fascinating dynamic at play. Parents are driven to ensure their offspring survive and pass on their genes, but from the child's perspective, the goal is to maximize their own share of parental resources.
So even within a loving family unit, there can be a subtle competition for resources and attention.
Exactly. And this tension isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can actually be a source of growth and adaptation. Think about sibling rivalry. It can be frustrating for parents, but it also pushes each child to develop their unique skills and strengths.
It makes me think of those nature documentaries where you see baby birds competing for food in the nest. The parents are trying to feed everyone, but the chicks are all vying for the biggest share.
It's a perfect analogy, and this dynamic doesn't just disappear when we become adults.
Yeah.
It continues to shape our relationships and social interactions throughout our lives.
It's like this underlying tension between our individual needs and the needs of the group. We're constantly navigating that balance.
We see this play out in Anna's story, which we touched on earlier. She made the incredibly difficult decision to give up her child for adoption. It was a decision driven by a desire to provide her child with a better life, even though it meant sacrificing her own happiness.
That story really stayed with me. It speaks to the complexities of the nurturer type, the inherent drive to care for others. Anna's choice highlights how sometimes nurturing means letting go.
Her story also exemplifies the tension between individual needs and societal pressures. She faced immense judgment for her decision, highlighting how societal norms can sometimes clash with individual circumstances.
It makes you wonder how much of our behavior is truly driven by our own desires versus the expectations of our culture or social group.
It's a constant interplay, and it's why understanding these different types and motivations is so important. It helps us navigate these complex social dynamics with more awareness and compassion.
This deep dive has definitely challenged some of my assumptions about human nature. It's not as simple as good versus bad, or selfish versus selfless. There's a whole spectrum of motivations and behaviors at play.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another intriguing aspect of this exploration, the power of storytelling. Throughout our sources, we see how individual narratives can illuminate broader truths about the human experience.
Tony Nicholson's fight for the right to die with dignity comes to mind. His personal struggle sparked a much larger conversation about autonomy, suffering, and the meaning of a good life. It transcended his individual experience and touched on universal themes we all grapple with.
It's a reminder that personal stories have the power to connect us, to foster empathy. And to challenge our perspectives, they can be a catalyst for social change, prompting us to rethink our assumptions and consider new possibilities.
It's like that saying, change happens one story at a time. And it makes me wonder if we need to create more spaces for these kinds of stories to be shared. Perhaps that's one way to cultivate greater understanding and compassion in our world.
Now, here's a thought that might seem a bit jarring at first, and in some ways, humans aren't that different from insects.
Okay, I'm going to need you to unpack that one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite seeing the resemblance.
It's not about physical similarities, of course, but when you look at certain social behaviors, particularly in the realm of group dynamics and self-sacrifice, fascinating parallels emerge.
Interesting. I'm remembering that research we looked at on goby fish and target similarity. It showed how, even in the animal kingdom, creatures are more likely to harm those they perceive as different or outside their group. It's a strategy that seems to have evolved across species.
Exactly. So this tendency to divide the world into us and them isn't solely a human flaw. It's deeply rooted in our evolutionary past, likely serving as a way to protect ourselves and our resources in a world of scarcity and competition.
But the downside is that this instinct can lead to prejudice, discrimination, and violence. It's a reminder that while we've made incredible progress as a species, we still carry these primal instincts within us.
And understanding these evolutionary roots is crucial if we want to mitigate those negative consequences. If we can acknowledge that these tendencies are part of our biological inheritance, we can start to develop strategies to overcome them and foster a more inclusive and compassionate world.
You mentioned self-sacrifice. I'm curious to explore how that concept plays out in both the animal kingdom and human societies.
It's a fascinating paradox, because on the surface, it seems counterintuitive for individuals to put their own lives at risk for the benefit of others. From an evolutionary perspective, self-preservation is paramount.
Right. It doesn't seem logical to risk your own survival yet. We see examples of self-sacrifice throughout nature and human history. Ants sacrificing themselves to protect the colony. Soldiers dying for their country. It's a recurring theme.
One explanation is kin selection, the idea that we're more likely to sacrifice ourselves for those who share our genes. Even if an individual dies, their genes can still be passed on through their relatives.
So in a way, it's still a form of self-preservation, ensuring the continuation of your genetic line. But what about acts of self-sacrifice that extend beyond kinship? What about people who risk their lives for complete strangers?
Those acts are more complex and demonstrate the power of group identification. People are more likely to sacrifice themselves for those they consider part of their group, whether it's based on shared ethnicity, nationality, or even ideology.
Like Kathy Bukovac, who risked her career to protect victims of sex trafficking. It seems like she identified so strongly with their suffering that she was willing to put herself on the line.
It's a profound example of how group identification can transcend our instinct for self-preservation, and it speaks to the power of empathy to motivate us to act in ways that benefit others, even at a personal cost.
It's a reminder that humans are capable of great altruism and that our sense of belonging, of connection to a larger group, can be a powerful force for good.
It's also a reminder that resilience, the ability to adapt and thrive in the face of adversity, isn't just an individual trait, it's something we can cultivate on a societal level.
That brings to mind the incredible story of Laika, the Soviet space dog who was the first living being to orbit Earth. It was a one-way mission, and while it's a tragic story, it paved the way for future space exploration.
Laika's story, and the stories of countless other animals who've contributed to scientific advancement, speaks to this larger idea of collective resilience and the interconnectedness of life on Earth.
It's a humbling thought we often focus on human achievement, but it's important to acknowledge the contributions of all living beings to our understanding of the world.
Speaking of interconnectedness, this brings us to a question that has intrigued scientists and philosophers for centuries. Is human behavior shaped primarily by nature or nurture?
The age-old debate. It seems like a bit of a false dichotomy, though, doesn't it?
It does, and the research we've explored certainly supports that it's not an either-or proposition.
Right.
It's about the complex interplay between our genetic predispositions and our lived experiences.
There was that fascinating study we looked at which showed how childhood trauma can actually alter the physical structure of the brain, particularly the amygdala, which plays a key role in processing emotions.
It's a powerful example of how our environment can shape us on a fundamental level. It underscores the importance of creating nurturing and supportive environments, especially for children. Early experiences can have a lasting impact on brain development and emotional well-being.
It makes you think about the responsibility we have not only to our own children, but to all children, to create a world where they can thrive. If trauma can have such a profound impact on the brain, then imagine the positive potential of love, support, and enriching experiences.
It's a thought worth holding on to, and it connects back to that idea of collective resilience we were discussing earlier. If we want to create a more resilient and compassionate society, we need to invest in nurturing the next generation.
This deep dive has really been a journey of uncovering layers upon layers of complexity within human nature. We've talked about empathy, resilience, the pull of the group, and the tension between individual and collective needs. It's made me realize just how much we still don't know about ourselves.
And that's the beauty of it. The more we explore, the more we realize there's always more to discover.
This brings up something we haven't explicitly talked about, but that's been woven throughout our discussion, the concept of conspicuous generosity. The idea that sometimes people act altruistically not just out of pure selflessness, but also because it benefits their social standing.
It's a fascinating concept that challenges our traditional assumptions about altruism. It suggests that even seemingly selfless acts can be influenced by self-interest.
It's a little bit unsettling at first, like does it diminish the act if it's not entirely selfless?
That's a great question, and it's one that researchers have debated for years. But here's a different way to look at it. Does it really matter what the motivation is as long as the outcome is positive?
I see what you mean if someone donates to a charity to impress their peers. But that donation still helps people in need. Isn't that a good thing overall?
Exactly. And if conspicuous generosity encourages more people to give, then it's a win-win situation. It's about understanding the complexities of human motivation and recognizing that even seemingly self-serving actions can contribute to a greater good.
So instead of judging people's motives, maybe we should focus on creating systems and environments that encourage pro-social behavior, regardless of the underlying reasons. If we can make it socially rewarding to be kind, compassionate, and generous, then that's a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. It's about working with human nature, not against it.
And it makes me think about that study we looked at with the male college students who doubled their charitable donations when there was an attractive female student in the room. It's a humorous example, but it illustrates the point beautifully.
Sometimes the most effective way to promote pro-social behavior is to tap into those underlying motivations and make it socially desirable.
So it's about appealing to both our better angels and our more self-interested impulses.
Exactly. And speaking of our better angels, I want to circle back to this idea that humans have a fundamental need to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves.
We touched on this earlier with a cyberball experiment and the pull of the group. It seems like that need for belonging is a powerful force that can be harnessed for both good and bad.
Absolutely. And I think it's an essential piece of the puzzle when we're talking about creating a more just and compassionate world. It's not enough to just focus on individual well-being. We also need to cultivate a sense of community, of shared purpose, of collective responsibility.
It's like that saying, we're all in this together, when we feel connected to others. When we recognize our shared humanity, we're more likely to support each other, to cooperate, and to work towards common goals.
And that sense of interconnectedness can be incredibly powerful, especially in the face of the challenges we're facing as a global community.
But in a world that often feels so divided and polarized, how do we cultivate that sense of unity? How do we bridge those divides and remind people of our shared humanity?
That's where the power of storytelling comes in. Stories have this unique ability to connect us across cultures, to foster empathy, and to remind us of what we have in common, despite our differences.
It's like that line from Daniel Deronda where George Eliot writes, "The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet, or novelist, is the extension of our sympathies."
It's a beautiful quote, and it perfectly captures the power of stories to expand our understanding and our empathy.
And in a world that often feels fractured and fragmented, that power is more important than ever. It's a reminder that we're not just isolated individuals, we're part of a larger human story, a story that's still being written.
And that's a story I think is worth fighting for, a story that's worth believing in.
It seems like we keep circling back to this idea of hope, this belief that even in the face of darkness and adversity, there's still potential for good.
Hope is essential. Without it, it's easy to succumb to cynicism and despair. But when we believe that a better world is possible, we're more likely to act in ways that contribute to its creation.
It reminds me of that quote from Margaret Mead. "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has."
It's a powerful reminder that even small acts of kindness, courage, and compassion can have a ripple effect, creating positive change that extends far beyond ourselves.
And that's what this deep dive has ultimately been about, exploring the complexities of human nature, both the light and the shadow, and uncovering those glimmers of hope that remind us of our potential for good. Feels like we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We've explored some truly fascinating aspects of human nature, from the depths of empathy to the power of storytelling.
And we've encountered individuals who demonstrate both the resilience and the capacity for both. Great good and destructive acts that seem to define our species.
Yeah, it's a reminder that human behavior is incredibly nuanced, and there's no simple answer to the question of what makes us who we are.
I'm curious, though, what are your biggest takeaways from all of this? What's really stuck with you?
For me, it's the recognition that human behavior isn't predetermined. We have these 10 types as a framework, but the way they express themselves in each individual is so incredibly varied.
Yeah, it's like we all have the same set of ingredients, but the recipe turns out differently every time.
Exactly, and that's where I think our potential lies, if we can understand these underlying motivations and patterns of behavior. Maybe we can create environments and systems that nudge people towards expressing those types in a more positive way.
So instead of trying to force people into rigid categories, we embrace the diversity of human expression and find ways to channel that energy towards creating a better world.
Precisely, and that brings me to another takeaway that I found particularly thought-provoking. The idea that even seemingly self-serving actions can contribute to a greater good.
You're talking about conspicuous generosity again, right?
Yes, it's this idea that sometimes people engage in acts of kindness or generosity, not just out of pure altruism, but also because it enhances their social status or reputation.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head-scratcher at first because it challenges our traditional notions of what motivates people to do good.
Right, but as we discussed earlier, does the motivation really matter if the outcome is positive?
I suppose not if someone donates to a charity to impress their friends, but that donation still helps people in need, then ultimately it's a positive act.
Exactly, and I think there's a valuable lesson there instead of getting hung up on judging people's motives. We should focus on creating systems and environments that encourage pro-social behavior, regardless of the underlying reasons.
So it's about creating a culture where kindness, compassion, and generosity are celebrated and rewarded, whether they're motivated by altruism or social pressure.
Precisely. It's about working with human nature, not against it.
And speaking of working with human nature, one of the themes that has really resonated with me throughout this deep dive is the importance of recognizing our shared humanity.
That's a powerful point because it's so easy to get caught up in our differences, our individual struggles, our tribal affiliations.
Right.
But when we take a step back and really look at each other, we realize that we're all connected. We all share the same basic needs and desires. We all experience joy and sorrow, love and loss.
Yeah.
And it's that recognition of our shared humanity that I believe is essential for creating a more just compassionate and peaceful world.
It's what allows us to empathize with others, even those who seem different from us. It's what motivates us to act in ways that benefit the collective good, even when it requires personal sacrifice.
And it's what gives me hope for the future, because despite all the challenges we face, I believe that deep down we all long for a world where everyone can thrive.
That's a beautiful thought, and it's a reminder that even small acts of kindness, courage, and compassion can make a difference.
Exactly, because those small acts have a ripple effect, creating positive change that extends far beyond ourselves.
So to our listener, we hope this deep dive is giving you some new insights into the complexities of human nature. We've explored a lot of ground, but the journey of understanding ourselves and each other is ongoing.
It is keep questioning, keep exploring, keep connecting. The answers are out there waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe you'll even uncover some new insights that we missed. We're all in this together after all.
And that's a hopeful thought to end on, don't you think?
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration into the fascinating world of human behavior.